Today we're making a custom Mandalorian sidearm that's inspired a little bit by Dirty Harry, a touch by Mad Max, but all Mando. Let's go! How's it going? Anthony Fro here, Create Sci-Fi. Today we're making a Mandalorian sidearm. A custom mashup one that I am so happy with, and it's the final Mando build, and I think it's the icing on the cake. And the final Mando build, how can I be saying that? Well, because 2 weeks ago I finished shooting the Mandalorian Star Wars fan film. Yes, it's finally coming. I've been talking about that for almost a year, since COVID. If you're watching this in the future, this has been the year of COVID. If you're watching it in real time, it's been like almost a year, and it's been very satisfying. Now, the reason that I never brought you this is because as soon as I finished it, because we were getting close to shooting, I had it in the actors' hands, right? So what you want to do is you want to get it in the hands of the actors so they can work out, you know, how to best sort of use this in the film. You don't want to be spending a half an hour on the shoot day practicing. So what's cool about this for me is the PAUZA disruptor rifle file, which I made, I think it was almost the first or second episode of my series on this, is amazing, right? So I'll link to that, and there you can find PAUZA's model. So what I did is I took his model and I sort of scrunched it down, and then this iconic sort of fork, right, that the energy comes out of, I modified this. And what I was going for, hopefully you picked up by now, is a sawed-off shotgun. So the thought was, you know, Dirty Harry, right? He's got the Magnum. So that's like an iconic, it's a huge gun. It's like a big character, he has that huge gun. I had the idea of, okay, what if we took the disruptor rifle and we made like a sawed-off shotgun version of that? And that was looking pretty good, but there was something wrong here. And then it was like, oh, Mad Max. So then I looked at the Mad Max, and this file is actually from like a Mad Max sawed-off shotgun file. And then I put them all together, and then this is the gun, right? So very happy with that. And I think I achieved my goal, which was, in my film, my Mandalorian character is not the Mandalorian from the TV show, it's a Mandalorian, right? So I wanted him to have something that sort of was special to him, and this certainly fits the build. All right, so again, how can I say this is the last Mando build? Because I shot it. All right, let's get into the build. Okay, diving right into 3D printing. All right, so yeah, this is just basically the same file that I used with the disruptor rifle. And then there's my original concept. That is sawed off, like in a traditional sense. I sawed off the handle. And then I just simply sawed off the forks, which are the iconic part of this whole rifle, right? So it's, you know, it's not working, right? But it's like you have to kind of go through all that trouble. That was a lot of work. But I realized here, so I needed more traditional sort of sawed-off shotgun grip. So I found a Mad Max file, of all things, and then it kind of seemed actually perfect, sort of in the big picture, right? Sort of thematically. And I printed that out. And what I'm doing here is, because I printed end to end, that's almost like end grain, if you're familiar with sort of woodworking, and you know that's going to fail, right? So what I did here is I kind of made a biscuit out of just some scrap styrene plastic, and I'm just putting like a little biscuit in here. And, you know, this is the sort of thing, like, yeah, I'm 3D printing, but for those of you who are just with me making practical stuff, this is something that you want to do. You never want to glue things end to end, right? It's always going to just fail. So by putting in this little biscuit, it gives it more surface area for the glue, and it just makes it a better fit, right? So there I did the old baking soda super glue to do like a quick Bondo treatment, just to fill up the holes and the gaps. And then now I'm going to start sanding that, right? So it's sort of like I said, like a poor man's Bondo, but more than that, it just helps to make things go quicker, if that makes sense, right? Because you want to keep the train rolling, because these things take a lot of time, right? So anything that's going to gum up the works, you really want to move on from that, right? So here is the main core piece of the disruptor rifle, and this is sort of one thing that I wanted to make sure you see, because I think this is like a visual cue, but because I'm doing a sawed off shotgun version of this, I really wanted to compress this and just make it as have a little of a footprint as possible, but still maintain sort of the core designs of it that make you recognize what it is. Right, so here I'm just sanding this off with my poor man's table sander. I just usually just flip the belt sander upside down. You got to be careful when you do that. I wouldn't recommend that, but it does work, and I certainly take pause before I do that. So here you can see what I'm maintaining is that sort of, it's that cradle that's going to have like the diamond thing in there. So that's there. I'm making sure that all my pieces fit. Now, if you go back to my disruptor rifle build, it all kind of hangs off of this PVC pipe, right? So as I'm building it, I'm testing the fit up on that. So here I'm just making some channels for the glue. So what'll happen is if you don't make some channels, you're gonna force all that glue in there, and it's gonna give you like an air gap, right? So you wanna have an escape route for that, basically. And you know, these are things that I've learned the hard ways over the years, so I'll share it with you so you don't have to go through it. So a lot of 5-minute epoxy in this build, so just mixing this up. And what I found is I like to get the 5-minute epoxies where I can just use a little bit at a time. This way, sort of as I move along with the build, I just use as much as I need. And the 5-minute epoxy is a pretty serious bond, right? Like once you do this, like you're not really worried about it. So putting some epoxy on there, and now it's like we're going, we're building this rifle, this sawed off shotgun, right? And then in the rifle for the lower barrel, that was a piece of graphite rod that I used. But for this, because it's so short, I end up just using this wooden dowel, which ends up being fine. So here I'm clamping everything together. All the time when you're gluing, you want to clamp, glue, clamp. They kind of go hand in hand. If you glue and don't clamp, you usually end up regretting it. So here's some more sort of that quick and easy Bondo. And here, I know that not all of this is going to be visible because it's going to be covered by a second piece. So I really just only use it where I need it, right? So that's moving along, sand that. And like I said, you know, broken record, but you know, with the super glue, that's just bang, bang, boom. We can move on. Whereas if it was Bondo, I'd have to set it aside. You walk away, maybe you get distracted. Next thing you know, this build is taking you 2 weeks. All right, so now the lower barrel, which, like I said, things hang off of it, right? So it's more like guidelines. So you need to keep checking that everything is fitting. And then more sanding. And there it is, right? And you know, I wanted to show you this process. I could have just started the video with that, but I wanted to show you that I had to do trial and error to get to this, right? Because that's an important part of the process. You don't want to overlook that, right? So here we go. This is looking like what I want it now. So now we get into the fun part. Not really. So sanding, more sanding. Now I find with these sort of pieces, right, if you're organized about it, right, so I sort of break it all down. I know everything fits, and I'm just going to approach it just one piece at a time, right? And I like to use the sanding sponges and when it's weird shapes like this gun, because that just, I don't know, I found it just makes my life easier, right? So here I am just sanding, and sanding some more. And then when you're done sanding, you probably could have sanded more, but you know, you use your judgment. So here again, going back to like not wanting to waste time, the wood filler tends to go quicker than the Bondo, and it's a little easier to work with. When I have to do substantial things and build out and I want them to be strong, like on the speeder bike where I was like creating body parts, then I use the Bondo. But for this, you know, I'm just filling holes, filling gaps. That wood filler works really well for that, right? So here's my basket of parts, and usually I use the basket, you know, to keep track of what I sanded goes in the basket, and it's just, you know, put on some music, put on a podcast, and just get at it. So here, I have my palm sander, and now I'm just going with the shop vac getting rid of the dust, I vacuum it and then reverse it and blow it out. I always talk about how the shop vac is my poor man's compressed air. And then I always do steel wool, and steel wool is not really necessary, but that's sort of like my dummy pass. Especially with finicky pieces like this, I always just go over everything with the steel wool, and then that way if there's like a little crevice or like a little nook or something that I missed, at least it gets hit. And so you want to make sure that your paint has a really good chance to stick, because nothing worse than doing all this work and then your paint doesn't stick. And then now finally, this is like a tack cloth. And what I do here is just make sure to get all the remnants of the dust off there. And again, it's like you're looking at it when you're doing this, right? You're just kind of like, it's almost like an excuse to re-examine the whole thing. The stuff is sticky, right? So it makes it tacky, and you know that the paint is going to stick. And, all this stuff is systematic. You just kind of, knock things off one at a time. So now more 5-minute epoxy, right? We got to glue. So here, I'm just going to mix together what I need, right? So it's, it's repetitive, right? Sorry. I like stalled out on that because there's no other way to say it. It's just, repetitive. And then, I could leave a lot of this stuff out, but, it is what it is, right? So, I want to represent the actual work that we have to do to make these things, right? So now I'm doing the bond, right? So that, you see, it has the biscuit, like what I talked about earlier when we did the handle. And then that one was actually built into the model. So now, we're just 5-minute epoxying these pieces. And the reason I use the 5-minute epoxy instead of like super glue on this is because, all these things are sort of interlocking. And, with super glue, if you have to get it right in there, and then if you don't, it's a whole mess. So the 5-minute epoxy, it's a really super strong bond, but it also gives you a chance to finesse it, to sort of wiggle it around, right? So that's the exciting part, right? That's like, okay, we're getting there. So now we're gonna paint it. So I just put a coat of primer on off camera there. And here, what I'm gonna do is more sanding. So now I'm using a higher grit, finer sandpaper. And we want to just get this to like almost like a glass finish, right? Because we're getting into the final stages. Because after this, I'm going to put the actual base coat to the final thing. So here, just sanding. I don't know what else to say about sanding, but it's worth it. And it's not worth it if you don't do it. So it's a necessary evil, right? And whoever invents a way to bypass this is going to be a very rich person. But again, like I said, I find that, all of this sanding, one of the positive things of it is you become really intimate with your piece. You have like a really deep knowledge of all the parts, and what I tend to do is when I'm sanding, I daydream like, oh, this is going to be dark, this is going to be metallic, or I think about what it's going to look like, right? So this final stage, now we're sanded, we have the gray primer, and I'm just looking for just sort of like, okay, speak now or forever hold your peace. Like just little dings or scratches that I feel like I won't be able to live with. And you just go through with this air drying spot putty, which is another like Bondo auto body product, and just go through. And, over the years, I've used spatulas and all sorts of tools, but I find that I just find it better just to use my finger, because you can just get in there, you get a feel of it, you can use the amount you need, you don't overuse it, and then you want to just go through and sand the whole thing again. But we're getting close to the end of sanding, and this is when it's the finished work, it's a little more rewarding, and it's kind of like, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, so you just kind of just blow through this. And also, when you're doing this work, you're noticing oh, okay, you know, this, again, I said this earlier, this is gonna be chrome, this is gonna be flat, etc. You start making a plan in your head, right? So there, I'm gonna hit it with one more coat of the primer, right? And then, yeah, this was a lot of work, so I'm burning the midnight oil. That was at night. So now it comes in and I'm like, okay, we are ready for takeoff, right? So I'm gonna do one last steel wool, just knock down all the rough patches of the primer, just wanna get it all smoothed out because I'm gonna wanna put on my base coat and I just want everything to be smooth, right? So here I'm just gonna clean everything off with some isopropyl alcohol, and that just gets off, you know, I'm wearing the rubber gloves, but if there's any fingerprints or if there's any like random dirt or oils on there, we get rid of them, right? Just taking one final look. And this is that Rust-Oleum matte black that I really like. It's like a rim paint. So it's even though it's matte, it's a little thicker. And I basically did the whole Mandalorian build with this paint, right? So thematically, I'm just sticking with this. Now I'm just doing a dry brush with the silver paint. We know that I love the dry brush. And, you know, if you've been following this series, you'll notice that there's like a theme, right? Like there's a certain technique that I'm applying to the helmet, to the armor, now to the gun. I even use this on the speeder bike, right? So it's not that I do this all the time, but it's just for this particular piece, I'm telling a story. And, you know, once I got this paint dialed in, I think it was on the armor that I sort of figured out this paint job. It's carrying on to everything else, and it helps to tie everything together. And then sort of a residual thing of that is you get better at it. So here I'm masking everything off that I don't want to paint gloss black. So I'm going to do a coat of gloss black because what I'm going to do is these certain pieces, like I was talking about earlier when I was sanding and daydreaming about, I'm going to hit with the graphite treatment, right? So I just want, even though it's like, you know, maybe 1/5 of the whole piece that I want to pop, you still got to go through all that trouble because otherwise you'll just mess up your paint job and it's not worth it, right? So here's my little magic graphite. This is one of my favorite things to do. We got that base of gloss black on there, and now just whoosh, instant awesome. And now we're gonna demask, right? So that's the fun part, but in this build is still a few more steps, right? So it's demasked, right? So, okay, that looks good, but, you know, wait for it. And I'm masking again. So now I'm going to use some Plasti Dip, and I like to use the Plasti Dip for anything that's like a handle or something that the hands grab. And this is like 1/10 of the whole piece. But if you don't mask off the whole thing, you will regret it. And I'll say that again, if you don't mask off the whole thing, you will regret it. You've been warned. You know, if you think you can get away with it, go for it. But I don't know, you never win. So here I'm gonna hit the whole thing with some Plasti Dip. And what I like about that is you'll notice it reflects light differently than, you know, like the black spray paint. And it's just for the actors, it gives it's a nicer feel in their hands. It's like, I like to do these little things that make it feel more like a real object than a prop. And, you know, you can certainly get away without using the Plasti Dip, but I find that it adds value. I think it's definitely worth it. And then you see there what I was talking about, how it reflects light differently, right? So here I decide I need to make a holster. So I'm not thinking about it till now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take I have this, you know, this piece of metal, just a piece of hardware store flat bar. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this bottom rail on the gun, which is a 3D print. And I'm going to use that to use a magnet system for my holster that I conceptualized in my head, right? So this is this is one of those things that I enjoy. So there was no plan for this. So this is unfolding for you, you know, real time for me as well. I'm just sort of figuring this out as I go along. So the main sort of nuts and bolts component of this is going to be this metal plate that I'm going to attach to the gun. And then that's going to give the positive grip to the magnets that are going to be a part of the holster, right? So one of the disadvantages of not thinking about this ahead of time is now I have to undo some work, but you know, it's not really a big deal. So I cleaned that out, and then because this is metal, I'm not going to use a 5-minute epoxy. I'm going to use a JB Weld, which is basically like a 5-minute epoxy, but you use that for metal. All right, so there it is there, and I just cleaned out that area where the plastic was. I made it the same size as this piece of flat bar that I have. All right, so mix this stuff up, and then once you think you have it mixed, mix it a little more. Again, ask me how I know these things. It's like, why isn't that drying? It's, oh, because I didn't mix it 3 more times, and now I got to redo the whole thing. So here, you know, it's, you know, all these epoxies, and they're really great products, because like once you put it on there, that's not going anywhere, right? Weld, it's in the name. So there's more clamping, and then now I sort of have a good starting spot, right? And even like where it seeped out at the ends, it kind of like made this like weld look that I kind of like that, right? So there's the magnets, and see how strong that is? Like those rare earth magnets are really pretty amazing. So now I'm just creating a template, because what I want to do is have it cradle, you know, like a glove, like fit like a glove. I want it to be a very tight fit, and it's going to be sort of pressed fit into here is the way I mean that's the way it ends up being. But at this point here, I'm still like thinking in my head, how is this going to work out? And I find, you know, always make, anytime you're sort of creating something from your imagination, you can draw it out in Inkscape or Photoshop or just on paper, but it just always pays to make a cardboard template, right? And then you just see it. I always do that whenever I work in plastic or leather or foam, and it's something that, you know, you sort of imagine that you're like, I think I'm going to do it like this, but instead of going into the materials right away, you just make it out of cardboard. And then, you know, from there, you have a template. It might take you a little bit longer, but again, I've just found that, you know, front loading work saves time on the back end. So, you know, maybe it takes a little bit longer to do it with this template, but if you did it without the template, you'd probably spend the same amount of time having to finesse and potentially having to start from scratch, right? So it always pays to make the template. And then, you know, once you're using your real materials, like that plastic, the Sintra plastic, the stuff's not cheap, or foam or whatever, you know, you're not worried about wasting expensive materials, right? So the Sintra, you know, what I like about this is you just score it with a razor blade and boom, comes right off, snaps right off by hand, right? And that's like a complex curve, and it handles that really nicely. Then you take your heat gun. This is not a hair dryer, this is a heat gun. And now you can bend it, conform it into any shape that you want, right? So here I'm just sort of, you know, manhandling it, right? Piece of wood, right angles, always test fitting, right? Because we want these videos not to be 10 hours long, you know, in between all these cuts, you know, here I'm test fitting it, but I probably test fitted it 3 or 4 times before that. So now we have the piece. And then off camera, I put the magnets in there. Sometimes that happens off camera where you just sort of get so involved that you forgot to film it. So I apologize for that. But basically I just glued them in and then put a plate over the top of it to give it that square look, just to sort of clean it up. So here I have the cheap holster from the blaster gun that we made a few episodes back, and I'm just using that as a template because I know that's how far I want it to hang off of the belt. So that's a good bit of information to have. So I'm using that to sort of get that in the ballpark, because the leather is definitely not cheap and I don't want to waste that. And again, I'm making this up as I go along. So I'm fitting each piece as I go, thinking about everything, sort of it's unfolding, right? And you know, now it's getting to the place where you're like, okay, this is going to work. And you just start knocking off all your pieces. And it's weird with the SCI-FI, like the leather holsters, they really work. Like I've made holsters out of like foam and tried to make them like high-tech, futuristic looking. But just something, the leather just always sells it better. It's you know, one of those things. So here I'm toothing up the leather, because what I'm going to be doing now is taking some contact cement, and now I'm gluing leather to plastic, right? So the barge cement works really good for that. I mean, barge is pretty great stuff, right? So you put it on both sides, you wait for it to dry, to flash off, and then it sticks together, and then that's not, I mean, this is what your shoes are made out of, right? And you see this a lot in the foam work, like with Bill Duran over there in Punished Props and Evil Ted. You know, that's where I learned about the barge cement. And typically, well, almost exclusively, this is what you use when you're doing foam construction. But I find it also works for leather, and leather is similar to foam. So if you've been working in foam with your props and cosplay, moving into leather is not a big a deal as you would think. It's actually a pretty nice transition. So here I'm just cleaning off all my edges. Again, overcutting things because, you know, this is a prototype and a finished piece all in one. So here I'm just covering it with leather, and you know, I could have made the whole thing out of leather, but what I liked about having the plastic cores, because the way I conceptualize this is it's cradling this whole, like, you know, sawed off shotgun, right? And it's not a holster where it goes into it. It's sort of, it's like a clamshell. So I found that the plastic was just a more positive fit, and structurally it was just a better way to go. And then here's clamp. I watch a lot of guitar building videos, luthiers, and they're always clamping everything with a million clamps, and I sort of got inspired by that, because it really makes a difference, you know. So here, seeing how everything fits, you know, it's a little snug, so you got to make adjustments off camera. I'm sort of wiggling this, jiggling that, spreading it out a little. But now we're closing in on it. So now I'm going to cut out the holes for the belt, right? Because it's got to hang off the belt. It's a holster after all. These are just basic leather working tools, just punches and hammers. But you get a nice cleaner line than if you just cut that out with a razor blade, right? So that is coming together now. All right, so now I just wanted to have sort of like something like a dummy lock almost. So I'm gonna put a strip of leather over the top here with some Velcro, and then that way when the actor's just doing the regular stuff, it's not going to go anywhere, and then whenever they want to draw it, it's like, it's almost like a cool little action to do. It's like you'll flick that piece of leather off, and then, you know, pull your pistol, pull your shotgun. So now here, this is just some really thin foam, and I'm going to put this on the inside so that the gun doesn't get all jammed up, right? So it's just a nice sort of cushion for the gun, because after all, it is made out of plastic, not metal, right? So we don't want to jam it up. And, you know, I always talk about, like, it's always worth it, I think, to spend time on the details that you don't see. You know, the tendency is, like, if you don't see it, don't build it. But I don't know, I find that it's always better to build that stuff in. It just, you know, if I could be that guy, but it's you know, it's, I was gonna say it's like a hippie thing. It's like, it's just, there's a vibe, there's a feeling, right? New age, but that's my story, I'm sticking with it. So now I'm just doing some weathering, a little knife, right? Oh, he's in a knife fight, some stones. That's actually a chopstick. He got into a fight with some Chinese food. All right, so here's black leather dye, and this is the same leather dye that I used on the belt. So again, you know, making everything sort of conform to the same vibe, to the same look. And you know, you can't see my face, but I'm pretty happy there, right? So while that leather is drying, let me get into the weathering. So now I'm doing my typical water-based oil paints. I'll do a black wash over the whole thing, and that just really seeps into all of the really deep crevices, right? And you just blot that off with a paper towel, and that's what really gives the piece definition. And then I use the burnt umber, and I use that thicker. I don't thin that out as much, and that kind of gives me my rust vibe, right? You got to be careful with that because you could end up with a whole like sepia orange piece. Again, ask me how I know. But yeah, that just gives it that little bit of rust. And then I do my random colors, right? So I have a red metallic here. And what I do with these is I don't overthink it, right? I just put a little dab here, a little dab there. And what I tend to do is, you know, I'm taking off probably 90% of it, but there's always these little hints. And I really think that it really adds a lot. This is a copper, and you'll see like I just do it there. And really, I have no reason why I did it there. I just did. And then, like I said, I blot off most of it. And yeah, just gives it a little life. So a little clear. So while that's drying, so now we got to weather the leather. How do we weather the leather, right? So how I do it is with sandpaper, right? So we already did the dings and the dents, but now if we just hit it with a sandpaper, it ages it, right? It gives it like some different tones, some different qualities. And then I hit it with the file, put some scratches on there. And then, you know, when we weather the props, right, we always clear coat it with the matte. So with the leather, like conditioner, I usually use mink oil. I was out of mink oil. I don't forget what this conditioner is, but use mink oil. And the conditioner is sort of like putting the matte spray paint over the whole thing, right? Brings it all together. Nice. And dirt will stick to that, which I like. All right, so now that we have the weathering, now I'm going to go over this with the powders. And again, this is, usually you do one or the other, but I've did this throughout every single piece in this Mando build. And sort of my justification for this is I'm shooting out in the desert, right? So I want everything to be really dirty, really dusty. And the powders really give it a nice dusty look. So I put those deep into the crevices, and then now I just go everything with a brush. This is like my slate black, right? So this gives it like a sort of more of an industrial vibe to mix with the desert vibe. And then I just brush everything off. And then even by brushing it off, what it does is it kind of coats everything. And then the blue is like my special sauce. If you watch my videos, you know, I say this all the time about like the blue. It's like I have no reason at all for doing this. I just like it. I did it once by mistake, and now I do it every time. And there's something to be said for that. I joke about that, but it's, you know, that's how it works, you know. And then now the final, we're just gonna, because we did all that weathering and all of that dust and dirt, you take the silver rub and buff and you just bring back some of the highlights, right? Just, these are sort of, I don't know what they are. They're not cables, but you know, they sort of run through the whole piece. There's like a safety, and now I'm rubbing the rub and buff. And yeah, just have one last look. And that looks good. And now the beauty shots. Very happy with that. That was something that was really rewarding because I conceptualized it. I had to do it a couple times to get it right. And then when I finally got it right, it really paid off, I felt. So I'm really happy with this. This is my Mandalorian's sawed-off shotgun. It's their signature weapon. Very cool. So happy with that, right? And it achieved my goals, right? Like, I think this is definitely an iconic thing. I would think if you just saw this, I dare say you would think that it's something that I just took from that world already, that I didn't sort of mash up and create myself. I mean, I can't say that, you be the judge. And yeah, and I think, you know, when you see my film, you know, I think this, you know, the idea almost was to cast this as a character, and I think it fulfills that. I'm hoping that when you watch the film, you know, there'll be a moment of like, you're like, oh yeah, that gun, right? Like, it's memorable. Wow. Okay, so, you know, stay tuned. We're doing the VFX for the film now, so if you're watching this in the future, I'm sure you can just click on the film, but if you're following in real time, you know, VFX is gonna take at least a month, maybe 2. But we're on course. It's looking good. And I'll probably do a behind the scenes video next, and then probably like a trailer. So stay tuned. Well, as always, I hope you found this video useful. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Love to read the comments, and be sure to check out the merch shop. We got the Create Sci-Fi shirts, hats, all sorts of stuff there, and buying that stuff really helps to support the channel and helps me to make these films and these props. So remember, I'm just here to help make sci-fi.